So we know interest in the outcome is high, but what about the impact? What will it really have on Scotland, the UK, and beyond? We're joined from Toronto by Brett House. He's an expert on the rise of emerging markets and is a senior fellow at the non-partisan think tank CIGI. Most obvious issue, of course, currency. They've been talking about this for quite a while. It seems like each camp has a different take on this. Will Scotland be able to keep the pound? And why does it matter?
Well, Scotland is totally within its right to keep the pound if it wishes to do so, and the government in Westminster and London has no option to stop them should they decide to keep it as their currency. What's the impact? Well, the impact is really that if Scotland keeps the pound and goes independent, they lose control over monetary policy. It's one of the myths of independence that isn't really covered well in many of these discussions, that if you keep the currency but separate yourself politically, you actually reduce your autonomy rather than increase it.
Interesting. Those against the referendum have made a big deal out of why it would be a bad deal for Scotland to choose independence. Lots of examples of what Scotland would lose. But what about the rest of the UK? What is lost if Scotland decides to leave?
Well, if Scotland does leave, the UK falls from being the third largest economy in Europe to the fourth. It loses a military base that houses its Trident nuclear submarines on the west coast of Scotland. It loses most of its oil reserves, and it loses about 4 million people in population, which also will dent its stature in the world and a decent share of its economy. The other thing that changes substantially is voting calculus in the Westminster Parliament. It becomes very difficult for Labour to form a government with the loss of the seats in Scotland.
I was going to say the same thing. I think that's a dynamic people aren't talking about, but the political calculus is huge too, isn't it?
It really is.
Well, if Scotland voted yes, the challenges to assert itself in a global economy, what are some of those that it would face?
Well, first off, it has to decide what it's going to do with its financial affairs and its political affairs. The European Union has said very clearly that Scotland would have to reapply for membership. So you get a strange situation where Scotland is pulling itself out of one federal or union body and trying to join itself into another. So you see a bit of confusion for some time. You have confusion over whether they would keep the pound or move to their own currency. But if they move to their own currency or keep the pound, they still have to commit to adopting the euro as quickly as possible if they apply for European Union membership. You'd also see the movement of several head offices of major financial institutions out of Edinburgh and to London. And you'd see the Scottish Parliament having to renegotiate trade deals with the rest of the world that Britain is already party to.
And we've also heard the UK talking a lot about oil and defense issues with regards to Scotland. How do those play out?
Well, as I mentioned, the UK would lose a nuclear submarine base on the west coast of Scotland. They'd lose access to the oil reserves on the east coast and the North Sea. Both of those would dent UK standing substantially.
Brett House, live from Toronto for us. Thanks so much for your analysis.